All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the second of two guest lectures or learning explorations. And this is building off of lecture one, where we looked at defining what is extended grazing and why it is effective on farms and ranches, in addition to factors to consider while adopting your extended grazing plan. And today we'll be looking at applying our knowledge at a case study in extended grazing. All right, so in our last lecture, just as a reminder, we learned together about what is extended grazing, why it can work well for farmers and ranchers that include reasons such as economics, soil health, and crop rotation options, in addition to what are some of the factors to consider when developing an extended grazing plan. And by the end of this learning exploration here today, I hope that we can understand what the factors to consider when developing an extended grazing plan look like in real life. And in addition to practicing brainstorming the various outcomes of an extended grazing season that account for variations in weather, cattle energy needs, forage, and water sources. So you might wonder, well, how are we going to accomplish this? Well, we're going to put our knowledge to work and practice extended grazing. That is in our imaginations, of course. So today, I want you to pretend, unless you actually are, a farmer in the rural municipality of Cutknife, Saskatchewan, which is located in the black soil zone of Western Canada and also Western Saskatchewan. And our task today is that we are going to be feeding backgrounding calves. And backgrounding is this period between weaning and feedlot finishing, when calves are fed primarily a forage-based diet to help increase their frame size so that they can gain weight more efficiently once they enter the feedlot. Another goal during this period is a moderate weight gain around that 1 3/4 pounds a day. Now, we plan to feed these calves mostly on swath grazed barley, with a supplement of either rolled grain or pellets for most of the winter before they are sent off to the feedlot. And why would we want to do this? Well, first off, it's as a cost-saving measure, and then secondly, to get those manure and urine nutrients back onto the field to help with our soil health. So before we get into the thick of things, it is important for me to mention that this video does not cover all of the factors to consider for a swath grazing system for backgrounding calves on barley. For the sake of time, we will only be covering a subset of the factors to consider under this extended grazing system. So it is important that before taking on any new production practice on your farm, please consult with credible sources of information like your provincial Ministry of Agriculture, the Beef Cattle Research Council, BCRC, and other credible sources of information like this, because there is risk inherent in adopting any new agricultural practice on your farm, so please know before you go. Here are a few considerations that we'll cover just briefly now and not later on in the presentation. So barley, like many feed grains, is quite high in energy because of the starch that is contained within the endosperm that you can see here in this picture. Now, if cattle are left up to their own devices to be selective and sort the grain, they'll go for the grains first and not those stalks. And this is also something that you'll see in standing corn, which increases the risk of acidosis because of that high energy level. So there are many ways to avoid this. And one of the primary strategies is to cross-fence your field with a simple electric fence, and this can help prevent that sorting that the cattle will do, and they'll eat more of a mixture of the grains, leaves, and stalks. This will also help extend the amount of grazing days on your forage as well. Having electric paddocks being relatively small, recommended BCRC said about 2 to 3 days of available forage, will help move your cattle more often. And so that way the quality of the forage that they're eating doesn't fluctuate as much from high energy grains down to the stalks, up to high energy grains, and will be more consistent as you move along. Now, barley generally is a crop that has rough awns, which causes concern for grazing livestock because the awns can become lodged in the mouth and cause infections. So a way to avoid this is to use smooth awn barley varieties. Now our third point, while I'll cover this later on in our presentation, it's worth repeating that cattle need a reliable source of water to stay healthy and productive during the winter time. While snow can be an option, livestock managers must watch very closely to assure that livestock are not becoming dehydrated. Now, there are many options for winter water sources that do not freeze. And a good source of information against this, look to credible sources of information like your Provincial Ministry of Agriculture and the Beef Cattle Research Council, or BCRC. Now, yearlings may have never been exposed to grazing swaths in the wintertime. So it could be valuable to have them mixed up with a few mature cows as well who've had some exposure to swath grazing before to perhaps help accelerate that adjustment period when you first put them out there. All right, so now it's time to do a little bit of review. Now I know this means we have to work and go back to what we learned in the first video, but I think it'll help us all a little bit. So at the end of the introduction to extended grazing video, we went over the key factors to consider when planning your extended grazing system. Now, what were those 4 main factors to consider that we went over? And try name at least one sub-factor that was under each one of those main factors. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. All right, so now that you had some time to think, here are our main factors listed across the top of this table in dark yellow, followed by the sub-factors in the pale yellow below. While we saw many sub-factors to consider on the previous slide, we're just going to look at a subset of them here today so we can apply them to our background swath grazing operation in the RM of cut knife. And before we get into the body of our learning exploration here today, if any of you watching have experience or knowledge with extended grazing that I missed covering in this presentation, I'd be happy to hear from you. I'm always learning about this topic, and I'm always excited to hear what is working well for folks out there. So, what are some of the factors that we need to consider if we're going to be putting backgrounding calves into an extended grazing system like swath grazing? Also, for the sake of argument today, let's say that we have 80 head or 80 backgrounding calves that we are going to be putting into this swath grazing system. First thing that we should discuss is our production goals. In comparison to when we were talking about dry pregnant cows in the last video, backgrounding calves are different because we actually want to add weight over the fall and winter instead of just maintaining body condition, as was the case with those dry pregnant cows. Another factor to consider is how we measure our economic breakdown for this class of cattle. It's important to note that typically if you're looking at the cost of feeding cows over the winter, it's expressed in a dollars per cow per day type of idea. But when we're looking at backgrounding calves, you break it down typically on a dollars per kilogram or pound gained. So that's just something to be mindful of if you're doing a deep dive into the literature. Next is our nutritional requirements for our backgrounding calves. Now, we're just going to be very much simplifying what nutritional requirements all means today by just looking at crude protein, or CP, on this slide, and total digestible nutrients, or TDN. And TDN is a rough expression of how much material is available to supply energy to that unit of livestock by measuring approximately the amount of non-fibrous carbohydrate, digestible fat, digestible neutral detergent fiber, and digestible crude protein through something called the Weiss equation. And so background in calves typically have a higher crude protein and TDN requirement in comparison to those dry pregnant cows that we saw in the last video, where they needed about 55 to 60% crude protein, or sorry, total digestible nutrients, and 7 to 9% crude protein. And it's always important to remember that these are average nutritional requirements. The demands for your livestock will increase as the temperature decreases throughout the winter. So it's our job as livestock managers to be prepared to adjust your livestock feeding strategy as the weather shifts. Now that we know what background and calves need to get that desired gain, how can swath grazed barley meet those nutritional demands to deliver that approximately 1 3/4 pounds per gain per day? So, as far as concerning yield, based on studies conducted in the black soil zone in Lacombe, Alberta and Lanigan, Saskatchewan, swath grazed barley that is cut at the soft dough stage typically yields around 10 tons per hectare, and that's metric tons. Now, there isn't much research on the carrying capacity of barley swaths for background in cows. However, for dry pregnant cows, the carrying capacity can range from anywhere from about 341 to 879 cow days per hectare. Now, when it comes to the nutritional value of barley, the studies on barley swaths cut at the soft dough stage have a total digestible nutrient in that 60 to 61% range and a crude protein somewhere between 10 and 11%. Now, soft dough is when the inside of the barley grain is no longer watery and it starts to form a doughy paste. And it's always important to consider that with swath grazing, we'll seed later on in the growing season, typically in that mid to late June time period. So that's always important to understand when you're thinking of growth stage. Now, it's important to consider that supplemental feed is often required in these feeding systems just to accommodate for colder weather, but also forage quality that's kind of variable. And so in the studies that I mentioned in Lanigan and Lacombe, cattle were supplemented with either pellets or with a rolled grain, and that enabled them to get a gain of about 1.3 pounds per day in that Lanigan study, which is kind of below that average of what you shoot for. However, this doesn't mean that this system doesn't work at all, but you need to understand then whether that lower gain fits with the needs of your operation. And you can take steps to mitigate that lower gain by perhaps providing more supplement instead. After reviewing our considerations on livestock and the forage that we're using for this system, here's a question to get us thinking about things that we could add to this grazing system to improve it. What steps could we take as livestock managers to improve the nutritional value of the feed that we are providing for our background in calves? What do you think? Well, there's an easy one that I mentioned on the previous slide, that we could supplement their feed with rolled grain or pellets as well. But what are some other factors? Well, another one that I came up with was a little bit more proactive in that we could change what we're actually seeding in the first place by adding more species to the swath grazing mixture, like legumes and brassicas. And now there's most likely very many other strategies that we could use as well. And so that's where your creativity comes in. Now that we understand the needs of our livestock and the potential production and nutritional value of the forage we'll be grazing in this part of the province, what are the factors that we need to consider about the site that we are looking at using? This site is located in the RM of Cutknife that is west of North Battleford. Our barley will be seeded into a field that has historically been in annual crop production, which means that most of the trees and the shelter belts have been removed. As you can see here in this picture that was taken in the area, there's some trees, but they're on the peripheries of the field and quite a ways from the forage that the cattle are currently eating. So what that means is that we might require temporary windbreaks, which will most likely need to be provided as the weather cools down. Now it's important to consider this adds another cost item in owning these windbreaks and the labor to move them around. Next, we have our land base. We're working on 70 acres, pretend that we are, which comes down to about 28 hectares. Now, for our grazing days on the land, we're operating on that low end of the spectrum that we saw on the previous slide of about 341 cow days per hectare. And you can follow the math there through. So I chose the low end of this carrying capacity spectrum to chance that we will probably encounter some drought and assuming that backgrounding cows will eat more forage than dry pregnant cows, where that carrying capacity number was developed on. So it's important to take this idea of how many grazing days we'll get out of this piece of land with a little bit of grain of salt. Probably not a good idea to use it if you're making a pitch on Dragon's Den or going to the bank to get their advice on things too. Our next question considers the water source for our cattle. What would be the pros and the cons to relying on snow as our primary winter water source? I'll give you some time to answer this question. So here are some of the ideas that I came up with pros on the left, cons on the right. Now, this is by no means all encompassing, and if you have ideas on watering cattle with snow, I'd be happy to hear from you. So for the pros, one pro of using snow as water is you don't necessarily need permanent infrastructure, but you should always, and I mean always, have a plan B because Mother Nature will continuously throw curveballs at us when we're farming. Now, also, with standard watering sites, cattle tend to congregate around the watering site itself, which usually will churn up the soil there and leads to a high buildup of manure and urine that can run off in the spring. So by using snow, typically that manure and urine gets spread around the field a little bit more uniformly. Now looking at the cons, depending on when the snow comes and when it leaves, you may have to move your cattle or provide supplemental water. If you have to move the herd, maybe you won't be able to immediately use up all of your forage, and that could be a concern when scheduling cropping the next year. Cattle also have to warm up snow in their rumens to melt it, so they require a higher energy level in the feed. And so this is another consideration you have to keep in mind, that you might need to adjust those energy requirements of your cattle and provide a supplemental feed if necessary. And then winding things down, especially with yearlings, they may never have used snow as a water source before, so this may require an adjustment period to teach them. For more information on using snow as a winter water source, please refer to the links down at the bottom of this slide. In agriculture, weather across the entire year affects the performance of our operations, and so it's always important to consider how the current conditions, no matter at what month in the year you're at, affect the operation. And so that way we can anticipate a few months down the road what the effects will be. In the growing season, barley for swath grazing, like I mentioned earlier, is typically seeded in that mid to late June period, which can have different precipitation levels and soil moisture levels in comparison to the spring. Temperatures are often warmer later in the season when the barley will be flowering, which can affect the level of grain set. And remember, just like with things like corn, grain is the most important and energy-dense part of most grazing annuals, whether it's corn, triticale, things like millet, or anything like that. We want to maximize the grains. So just to keep that in mind, that the nutritional profile of your swath grazed barley will shift, for example, if it heads out in a heat wave. Next is extreme weather. Things like hail and heat waves and frost can affect the quality or even the yield of your forage. Maybe hail knocks it out completely. Something to consider with frost is nitrate levels. And so after a frost, leaves can accumulate high levels of nitrate, which is toxic to livestock. And so you want to be careful if we're going out to swath into the late summer and fall that we don't swath right after a hard frost. And you typically give some time to wait for those nitrates to dissipate throughout the plant. Now, as we shift into the grazing season itself, as the temperature drops, just like I said before, our energy demands for the cattle will go up. And I know I repeat this time and time again, but it's very important that we will need to provide different quantities of feed as the winter progresses. And then lastly is snow quantity and type. So snow is, like we mentioned before, is beneficial as a water supply, but it can also affect the access to the forage. I've heard from people who use a lot of extended grazing that crusty snow is actually the biggest problem versus deep snow, because well-trained cattle are able to paw through deep snow, but they will have difficulty getting through that icy crust at the top if there's a freeze-thaw cycle going on. So this concludes the second part of our two-part series on extending the grazing season. I hope that by working through these factors to consider together, we all learned a few things about the options for extending the grazing season and the factors to consider when making an extended grazing plan. If you have any ideas that you'd like to share about your experience with extended grazing or factors that I didn't touch on, please feel free to contact me by email. I always look forward to learning more about this topic, and getting the chance to share ideas makes us all a little bit better off. Thank you very much and have a great day.